Mohsin Zaidi, I am so delighted to welcome you onto my podcast. You are a best-selling author, a speaker, and you've been a criminal barrister, and I think now you're a management consultant, which I want to know more about.
Sure.
You're a winner of 2 prizes, the Polaris Salon Prize and the Lambda Literary Prize, which I'm both impressed by and quite jealous of. And your book, A Dutiful Boy, is a memoir of a gay Muslim's journey to acceptance. And in a way, in the title, is the answer to my first question, but I know that you can explain, which is, tell me about a challenge you're facing or have had to overcome.
Well, I mean, it's interesting, right, that question, because usually, to put it in simple terms, like when there's a hurdle, right, when there's literally a hurdle in a runner's way, all they have to do is jump over it. But for human beings, for us, whenever there is something difficult going on, usually it's not just as simple as jumping over one thing. It's so multifaceted. So in the answer I'm about to give you, in some ways it sounds really simple, but there's many more layers to it. And that is that I grew up in a poor part of London, in Walthamstow, to very religious Muslim parents. And I became the first person from my school to go to Oxford. And when I got there, I came to terms, or had to come to terms, with the fact that I was gay. And I put it in that way because it wasn't just that I was gay and Muslim. Actually, it was that there were so many ways in which I was forced to live outside of the worlds that I was supposed to inhabit. So I've answered that, but in a convoluted way, I think.
No, I think you've answered it in a very clear way. And what I get from what you're saying, and from your absolutely beautiful book, which I really loved, I have to say, and recommend to anyone listening, is that having to overcome it was because, as I understood it, being gay wasn't even something that was discussed. It wasn't a word that was in your family.
Yeah.
So, that you were experiencing your sexuality as like coming completely outside of what is safe and home and belonging. And so you had to battle with this sense of, I mean, I remember one of the worst things you said in the book is, do my parents wanted a dead son or a gay son? And
Yeah.
that sort of tearing between two impossible polarities was what the barrier was. So this was by no means a simple barrier to overcome, a simple challenge.
No, it wasn't. And I remember, actually, Julia, sorry to interrupt. Can you hear that background?
I can't, but it will on
Okay.
your recording.
Okay. I might see if I can get them to stop doing what they're doing, just because I don't want it to ruin your recording.
I'll press pause.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, I've hit resume. They've said that they'll stop.
Great. Shall I say that bit again?
I think I know where to pick up from if you'd rather
Okay.
not.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
When I came to writing that sentence, it to me was a really simple encapsulation of the depths of despair that I felt. Because that kind of, would they prefer a gay son or a dead son, was genuinely the question that went through my mind more than once a day. Because you know, as you set out, I didn't know the word. It didn't, you know, we didn't know anybody who was gay. We didn't even really see them on TV at the time. And it just felt as though my the very foundations upon which I existed would rot if I were to engage with my sexuality. And so it felt safer to keep it away. And then it was only when I got to university and I started asking myself these questions, it was only when I got to university that I realized that we don't exist in boxes, that we can try and compartmentalize this feeling from all our other emotions and this urge from all our other actions. But the effort, that trying to carve ourselves up, I think it's poisonous to us.
That trying to carve ourselves up, and that's carving yourself up. I mean, that's using a knife to slice off aspects of your core self, of your core identities.
Yeah. And
I think, you know, what you're saying is you were brought up in, you know, your parents had come from Pakistan. They were devout Muslims who came to this country in order to enhance your prospects as much as their own. And so that the kind of place that they lived and with the people that they lived, they needed to find a belonging, and your belonging was with them and your love for them and their love for you. But when you acknowledged your gay sexuality, that put you outside the place where you belonged as a kind of, as a threat. And that threat very nearly annihilated you, because
yes,
it felt you couldn't, there wasn't a compromise, there wasn't an alternative, a place to go.
Yeah.
So for people listening who may be in a similar situation, how did you navigate finding a place that you could begin to tell your mum and dad what happened?
It took years, I should say. I think it's important to say that up top, because I think sometimes people say to me, like, I know, where did you find the courage to tell your parents? And my answer to that is, courage is not something that is found. Courage is something that we must grow, and it grows over time.
And 11,000 prayers later when you wished you weren't gay.
Exactly. You know, I think.
And the disgust you had for yourself, was it a kind of like?
Absolutely. It was visceral. You know, but the thing is the way that it manifested itself was, before I would go anywhere near any other men, I would, you know, I'm going to be a bit explicit here, forgive me, but I would think about, I would think about men, and once my sexual urges had been satisfied, if I put it that way,
okay,
as soon as that happened, I'd be so disgusted with myself, and I'd have to shower, and I would be really down the rest of the day, because I had not managed to hold the willpower. It had overcome me. And that happened for a very long time. And then when I started seeing men, it was the same. There was one part of me that really wanted to be close to this person I was attracted to. And then another part of me that was absolutely disgusted by the sight of it and the thought of it. And it's really, sorry, go ahead.
Well, those are two completely oppositional desires and forces. You know, the desire you know, in your sense of identity, we need to know that we love and we belong for all who we are. But in this sexual identity, you wanted to love and belong with your tribe, with your parents, with your community in Walthamstow, with the people that you knew. And yet, where you were attracted to and drawn to, and actually only had sexual attraction to, put you completely outside of it. And so there wasn't a kind of an accommodation.
No,
there wasn't any kind of compromise in that.
No, I mean, you know, the thing, the image that comes to my mind is, you know, when you've got, let's say you've got somebody who's, is it hung, drawn, and quartered, the expression,
yes,
right? And drawn is the bit where they attach your arms to two different horses and then they rip you apart or something.
Oh, yes.
And I know it sounds awful, but that's what was happening inside. It was almost like one part of me was ripping to go the one way and another part of me was ripping to go the other.
Oh my goodness.
And what was happening was I was being broken by it.
Hung, drawn, and quartered internally with self-loathing, self-destruction, the shame, the disgust. Oh my goodness! Like I could really the kind of agony of that, and the sort of tearing apart, complete visceral tearing apart inside you. And I can see it in your face. It's like the scream of it.
And it was, you know, there would be moments where I'd just be kind of, you know, there's that expression crestfallen,
yes,
and because you fold into yourself. And for me, the reason that happened was because I could feel this going on inside, and I didn't know what to do with it. It really hurt. Sorry
to interrupt you. So the thing that was particularly challenging for you, which is my second question, is these kind of totally polarizing, internal rupturing pulls that you couldn't integrate, couldn't live alongside them both. And so it sounds like it was cuts by 1,000 knives. Like every day you'd be pulled one way, like I'm never going to look at a man or touch a man, and then the next moment you'd see someone you really fancied and want to touch him.
Absolutely. But I think the reason why it became so complicated was that on top of that, I had existed as a Pakistani in a predominantly Pakistani part of London, and then gone to Oxford where everybody was white. And I had existed, grew up in a council house, and at Oxford, everybody was rich. And so there were different ways in which, so I had this kind of internal thing going on, but then externally in my experiences, I was learning that I was poor. I was learning that I was brown, or that meant I was different. And that had came with its own complexities. You know, my sense of worth or my sense of self they were probably pretty low to begin. You know, getting into Oxford was never something I expected to happen. I remember calling them and saying, you know, did you make a mistake?
Did you?
I did. Yeah. I called the college office, and they remembered me because I called. And they laughed. And then when I got there, Deborah was the lady's name, and I remember she laughed. She said, I remember you. You're the one that called us to check if we hadn't made a mistake. But, you know, so that was going to university with no sense of self-worth, and then learning that you're poor, and learning that everybody looks at you and the first thing they think in a nightclub is that you must be the person with the drugs. That had an even,
oh my goodness,
kind of even more compounding detrimental impact on how I felt about my place in the world. So I'd gone from having a really firm understanding of my faith and my culture and my place within it, to thinking, okay, well, I can't be that anymore. So then suddenly being in this environment where people were talking about going on holidays and second homes and having professional parents, and talking about literature and the world and politics in a way that I had never engaged with before, I'd never been introduced to. And it made me feel small, and it made me feel like an outsider. And that's not to say that that was the intention of anybody I was discussing those things with, right? Not, you know, somebody talking about politics is not designed to be pretentious. Maybe you think it is pretentious, but that's not the point. The point is to talk about being engaged with the world. But because my circumstance had always been engaged with putting food on the table or finding a way to survive, having the luxury of talking about society and what's happening and art was just not something I'd ever been afforded. And so that sense of not belonging was compounded by these new experiences I was having as an outsider.
Yeah, I can really get that you already internally kind of split, and then you went to Oxford, and you were the first in your school in Walthamstow to go to Oxford. And you discovered there were whole hierarchies that you had no idea about: class, about money, about ethnicity. So you were an outsider even more, although it also introduced you to a way of life that was exciting. So it was another kind of split. But I hear you saying that you felt smaller, but actually also when I've kind of met you, it also was a gateway to get bigger. So again, it was another sort of contradiction.
Absolutely. You know, for the first time, I was in an environment where people just wanted to know what I thought and wanted to take the time to hear why, and wanted to help me develop my thinking, but also introduced me to concepts and to, you know, thinking about the world differently, and thinking about the ways in which decisions that politicians make have a direct impact on me as somebody who grew up in a council house. And yes, it allowed me not only to engage with the world in a different way, and taught me so much. Oxford was an education, not just in law, is how I put it, but it also enabled me to inhabit my skin more fully. I was able to find that confidence. I was able to eventually articulate what I thought, and I was able to recognize the ways in which I wasn't smaller than everybody else, and recognize the ways in which my difference made me more powerful, not less.
I can hear
that took time.
I can hear the excitement in your voice, in the sense that over time you found your voice by expanding the story you could talk about yourself. I'll say that again. You could expand your internal sense of yourself by expanding the story you told yourself about yourself.
Yes.
So, I mean, one of the things I talk about is the story we tell ourselves is the person I become. And it sounds like you had quite a narrow story before you went to Oxford. And then Oxford, as much as it was very discombobulating, it helped you in the sense it gave you multiple narratives, multiple ways of being, multiple kind of inputs that once you could overcome the kind of clamor of the shock of it all, you could begin to support yourself to be more confident. But how did you overcome that feeling small and the threat it initially gave you? What supported you? What helped you do that?
Well, you know, I love the way you put that about the stories we tell ourselves, because when I arrived at university, my story was, I'm going to read law, I'm going to become a lawyer, I'm going to marry a woman, I'm going to have kids, I'm going to live next door to my Pakistani parents. So
I'm going to be a dutiful boy.
Exactly. There's a siren going, so I'm just going to pause for a second until the siren goes.
Okay. You're in New York after all. Thank you for being sensitive to the recording.
Oh, it's just when I've done these, I know how complicated it can be if there's noises in the background. So that's the story that I had told myself, and that's the story I came to university with. And the very first thing in terms of the evolution of my sense of story, the very first thing to happen was that story was set on fire. And
set on fire?
It's set on fire. It was burnt to the ground because I had to stop. I had to stop believing that was my path. And I used that dramatic term, set on fire, because that's what happened. It was really kind of like a burning to the ground of everything that I had believed would be in my future. And so an Oxford facilitated
it
that.
sounds like a sort of, I think of Moses in the burning bush, but also like demonstrations with burning flags. It sounds so. What does fires do? They
level things.
They level things. They knock everything out.
Yeah, and that's exactly what needed to happen. I needed to knock everything out. I needed to erase.
That's the
Yeah.
word.
I mean, you know, the way I put it is that human beings were a bit like trees. So the way that trees, they grow into these beautiful creatures, but underneath they've got these roots.
Yeah.
And I was a young tree, and all of the roots that I had already grown, they were informed by my culture and my faith and my sense of family. And essentially what I had to do was rip them all out, uproot everything, and start again, because that was the only way of finding a new story.
Can I challenge that?
Yes.
Is the root that enabled you to rip out the roots of what your story should have been or was expected, was the deepest root, which was your attachment to your mum and dad, that the love they gave you and your siblings enabled you, although you didn't feel like it at the time, to dare to set fire to the pictures that you thought you should follow.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right about that. You know, my parents gave me this superpower of being able to love them and think kindly about the world and others. And I always say that I used it against them, because they taught me all this love, and then I used it to hold on to them even when they didn't want me to.
Because that is such an interesting, you know, all of us as children with our parents or having children is in some ways the most beautiful and the most painful thing that can happen to us, that children can, you know, fill us with pride and love and sparkle and break our hearts. And it sounds like the way that you held on to your children, held on to your mum and dad and your siblings, that in some ways you had to, was it break their heart, knowing that they, or daring, did you dare to let them, you said you held on to them, so I'm trying to work out how you held on to them when you set fire to the picture they wanted for you.
I had no confidence that everything would be okay.
Okay.
I didn't. I had no sense of what would happen, but I grew tired of believing that it was my responsibility to know.
Ah, that's interesting.
I got to the point where I thought, okay, this ball has to go into their court, because I can no longer hold all of these things. I can no longer be the kind of omnipotent one that says, okay, well, I'm not going to tell them about my sexuality. Sorry, I'm not going to tell them about my sexuality. I'm going to move away. I'm going to keep a distance from them, because this is how they will react, and these will be their emotions, and it will be harder for them to know that I'm gay versus for me to essentially estrange myself from them. And there was so much thinking and so much management of their feelings in the future, speculatively. And it was exhausting, but it was also not my job. You know, I was a child, I was like 18 years old. And so...
Can I pause you there and talk about, as a therapist, that's about boundaries, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Recognizing the limits of your responsibility. And you went right to the edge, and while you felt you had a responsibility for them, for their happiness, to protect them from your sexuality, to keep them happy, as it were, you also denied your capacity to live fully and didn't give them the option of coming through and loving you anyway.
Absolutely. And honestly, when I told them, I don't think I did it thinking, oh, you know, I'm going to give them the option. It was more, I just can't do this anymore.
Yeah, you got to you were going to either die or have to tell them.
Honestly, that was it.
You were suicidal, weren't you?
I was. And I think it's because I just felt like there was no way out. You know, I'm terrible at keeping secrets, I guess, my own secrets, not other people's, but I was terrible at keeping secrets. They really did
contaminate you.
Yeah, they polluted my experience of the world. And with each day that passed, the smog grew thicker. And I couldn't live like that. And so either, something had to give.
That's such a powerful image, isn't it? The smog grew thicker. So this idea of, it's a very overused term, but being our real selves, our authentic selves, is then what we're feeling and saying match, that there's an authenticity and a congruence. And what you were saying is that you got narrower and narrower and smaller and more kind of disappeared really behind the smog of the lies. And it was lies, really.
It was lies, yeah.
And that how secrets and lies not only can destroy a relationship, but can destroy you internally.
Yeah, and I think that for people listening, the way I would think about it is, imagine you are asked to lie to your loved one, to the person, your spouse, and you really don't feel comfortable lying to them. It's that, but 100 times worse, because it's inside and it's everything you say and everything you do and every interaction you have. Yeah, it's there. Sometimes it's more pronounced than other times, but it's that discomfort that we feel when we lie, but on a scale that is unlivable.
Unlivable. It's like a monster in a way that just grows and grows and grows the more you lie, and then everything you say, you just feel the monster, not what you're saying.
Yeah, and you get good at it. You get good at it. Like, I remember I started rewarding myself because I would tell stories about girls I'd met to friends and to family, and I would start giving them personas, and I got so good at it that people would ask me a question, I'd make something up on the spot, and then 2 weeks later I'd remember it, and then I'd add to it, and I would think to myself, how have I got to this point? And I think it's because lying felt like my only attempt at staying safe. And there is something deeply wrong, deeply problematic with the idea that a lie will keep you safe.
I mean, it is the kind of nexus of ill health, isn't it? Mental ill health is that a lie will keep you safe, because it can't possibly keep you safe for all the ways that you've described. Is that it separates you from yourself. It builds walls and massive divides between you and the external world, the people, the place, your job, every version of yourself. So you get kind of more and more poisoned and more kind of unlivable with living with yourself. So you got to the edge, but what kept you alive at that point? So what helped you stay alive and actually tell your parents?
Therapy.
Very glad to hear that.
I thought you might be.
Maureen, I actually know because I've read your book, but I'd encourage other people to read your book and learn about fabulous Maureen.
Yeah. Maureen was a university therapist, and I met her in my second year. And the very first thing I said to her was, you can't help me because I've thought about this in every which way, and there is no solution to my problem. And quite pointedly, in a way that kind of commanded respect straight off the bat, she said, well, if you think the only solution is to be straight, then you're right. I can't make you straight. But perhaps there's other ways of thinking about this. And that kind of challenge within about 5 minutes of meeting her was exactly what I needed. And I guess in kinder, softer ways, perhaps afterwards, that's what she did. She was the person who allowed me to look at the world in a different way. And, you know, we say that, but if you stop and think about how difficult that is as human beings, right? We have this history and of experiences and of influences and of relationships that tell us that these are the things that we are and these are the things that we will be. To have somebody that can come along and turn all of those noises down, right down to zero, and say, hey, turn that off, stand here with me and look at this situation in a more objective manner. That is a powerful, powerful superpower. And it's not a superpower that many of us possess.
That really is a powerful superpower. And because in sort of psych terms, what you're saying is that we are kind of over influenced by our pre-existing beliefs and biases. So we look to confirm them all the time. And what Maureen did in that simple sentence, to say, yes, maybe you're right, I can't. What did she say? I can't.
Maybe I can't. Essentially, she said, if what you think you need is to be made heterosexual, then you're right, I can't do that. But there are different ways of thinking about it if you'd like to explore them.
So by encouraging you to think about different ways of exploring it, she opened a small portal in your mind that invited you, and then I guess over time, gently kind of offered a bigger space for you to begin to explore different ways of being that wasn't being heterosexual.
Yeah. And and more than just wasn't being heterosexual, allowed me to think about myself and my place in the world based on a relationship with the things that I had at my disposal. I'll give you an example. She said to me once, because I was really, as I said at the outset, I was really insecure and really didn't feel like I belonged at Oxford, and I called them and asked them to double check they hadn't made a mistake. And I remember during one session, I had a meeting the next day, and I was about to go into, sorry, give me 1 second, Julia. Sorry, Julia.
That's all right.
So in a particular session, just after a particular session, I was going to this kind of meeting of more clever people at Oxford, and I was really nervous about it. And I said to her, like, oh, I'm worried that I'm going to look stupid, or I'm not going to know what people are talking about. And she said to me, Mohsin, have you ever been in a situation where once you had a basic understanding of what the conversation was about, you haven't been able to meaningfully contribute or ask questions that help you get to that place? And I paused and I really thought about the answer, and the answer was no. But it took for somebody else to teach me that was something I brought to the table, that actually when I turned up to a conversation or when I turned up in a room, I really tried to be present, and I really tried to engage meaningfully with concepts and with people and with emotions. And those things I learned. I didn't learn them from her. I learned that I possessed them by talking to her about them.
Because she could give you insight to how you were in a way that you didn't have for yourself. So she expanded your kind of understanding of yourself purely by feedback, by asking this very simple question.
Yeah.
And that, you know, in that moment, you went, oh, and it's not like she was telling you something, she was asking you to reflect. And in that moment, you could trust that actually you do bring something. Once you've understood what's going on, you do meaningfully contribute to the conversation, as you are to this one.
Well, I try, but it was, you know, that's exactly right. It was, she saw much more of me than I saw of myself.
That is what therapists do, I hope. I mean, it's a big part of what we do is reflect back aspects of yourself that remain entirely hidden, not in a way that there isn't some element of truth. So like she had obviously heard you, and so she integrated what you had an idea of in your mind and built on it. Wasn't kind of outside of your experience, because that would be too big a step, too big a leap to make. But can you tell us about telling your mother that you were gay, what that conversation, how much you prepared for it, what that conversation, how did it go?
Well,
you didn't tell your dad, did you?
No, I told eventually I told him about 3 or 4 years after telling my mum.
So she held the secret from him for 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, I mean,
and your siblings didn't know either.
Well, one of them was a child, so he's 13 years younger than me. So he didn't, he was a kid at the time, but the other one did. He did know. My sibling, the middle sibling, I'm the oldest. The middle sibling was the first in my family to know. My dad, I told, as I say, 3 or 4 years later. I planned to tell him on the same day I told my mum, but she was worried that he would kick me out of the house, so we didn't tell him on that day. But I actually think what happened was she was worried that it was true, and she thought that by telling another person, it would become more true, that she couldn't put it back in the bottle. And so I think what was really happening was she didn't want it to be true. And so by not telling my dad, it enabled her to believe that it was a falsity. But the reason it came about was not actually, funnily enough, I wasn't planning on coming out to her. I was offered a job with one of the biggest law firms in the world, and I ended up saying yes to it at Linklaters. And my family, as soon as I was offered that job, I was essentially going to be on more money than both my parents combined once I started. So for my family, this was huge. It was transformative, and my mum and dad, they loved planning. Once I got into Oxford, this future presented itself, and they couldn't, it was almost like, I don't know, being given this beautiful bouquet of flowers, and then you just keep looking at it, and then you keep rearranging it. And like, basically wherever you put the rose or the petal, it looks beautiful, but you kind of rearrange it just because you want to look at it again. And that was what my parents did with my future. They saw this beautiful thing, and they just wanted to keep moving it around and figuring out what the different configurations could be within a very, very narrow vase. And so the
zhuzhing in a way was their conviction really about safety. That as immigrants in this country, they were under threat all the day. They were under threat every day. You all were, from racism, from poverty, from all of the things, from being a minority.
Absence of opportunity,
education, all of the things, and which has big bad health outcomes as well, mental health and physical health. And so you represented to them a golden opportunity for a safe future. It wasn't the money per se, it was the fact that we're safe, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's that we were finally, it started at Oxford. It was like we were finally allowed into this club we call Britishness.
You were going to belong. You had a ticket in. You had the key to the door.
Yeah, exactly. And then by me having a key, I could open, exactly, or they were able to go through, exactly. So I was offered this job.
Sorry, just to interrupt you. No, that is a real thing, right? I mean, that isn't a false narrative. That is a true narrative.
No, absolutely. Because, the opportunities that are afforded to people that, in my case, go to places like Oxford and Cambridge are unrivaled. Britain is a class-based society, and those at the top have the benefit of much more of the fruits of Britain than those at the bottom.
Yeah.
And we had gone from being at the bottom, you know, in public housing in one of the poorest parts of the country, to suddenly me being in the circles, the upper echelons of British society, because I'd gone to this university that was attended by all of those people. I'd made relationships with all these people, and my professional and my personal future had been completely transformed by it. I'd been told, well, you belong here because you have this.
You've got this certificate.
Yeah, because you have this seeming intellect or ability, so you're allowed in. So it is transformative. It changes the way that people interact with you. It changes the opportunities that you are given. Most of the people I was at school with would never dream of living the life that I now live.
And were never given that opportunity.
No. And, you know, when I say I was the first person from my school to go to Oxford, I don't say that with pride. I think it's an indictment on British society when you have certain schools that send 100 people a year and other schools where it's been going for 30 years and I'm the first. But to go back to your question about coming out to my mum, the reason all of this is relevant is because when I was offered a job at Linklaters, it was yet another indication that this future was coming to fruition, that it was becoming the present. And the reason that was a problem was because my mum and dad started to rely on that future. They started to believe that this is what made them safe, and that future, my future, was in fact also their future. And I didn't mind.
So more weight for you in some ways.
Absolutely. Exactly. I didn't mind it, but the problem was that all of it was entirely irreconcilable with my sexuality. And I, by this point, decided that I wasn't going to hide. I mean, I didn't think I would necessarily tell them. I thought I would move away, but I decided I wasn't going to hide from myself anymore. You know, by this point,
that was a big first step. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd had a boyfriend. I'd made gay friends. So I just hadn't told them. And so when I was offered this job at Linklaters, my parents, the looks on their faces, they were so, it was relief. It was relief after years and years of trying their best to get out of this circumstance. The way I describe poverty is almost like a ditch. And because of our kind of capitalist society, the ditch just gets deeper and deeper and deeper.
You keep digging and digging and digging.
So the rich get further away from you and the poor get further into this ditch. And actually, you just have to scramble and scramble, and the scrambling gets more and more exhausting. And suddenly, for my parents, when I got into Oxford, the ditch stopped getting deeper. And
you
then
had a ladder.
Exactly. And then I got into Linklaters and I had a ladder because financially, we might be okay. And although all of that, I loved that. I loved being able to do that for them. But that relief on their faces brought despair to me because it felt like a lie. It felt false. And I didn't know what to do with it, because I just envisaged this time where their world, their sense of things, their sense of hope would be, I would rob them of it. And I hated that. I hated that. Can you imagine, your parents having this hope and then you being the person to steal it from them?
Well, you give them the answer to the immigrant's dream of I'm going to give you this ladder out of poverty and we're going to be secure and I'm going to have this future that you really want. And then with the other hand, as you're giving it to them, if you tell them that you're gay and you come out to them, you are robbing them of that safety at the moment that you give it to them. And so it's a kind of, again, another impossible bind.
So I told my mum that I was going to move out as soon as I started working. And to her, that was the most kind of white Western thing I could say, that, oh, I'm leaving. And it felt like a betrayal, And actually, in that moment, I didn't realize it. I'd robbed them of that relief because suddenly they felt like, oh, well, he doesn't want to share this.
You're abandoning us.
Yeah. Exactly. And that's when, and my mum didn't speak to me for 3 days after that conversation, when I said, I'm going to move out as soon as I start working. And they lived in London, you know, it wasn't even like I was going to be moving that far away, but there was something deeper. It was, to them, it represented, as you say, an abandonment. And after 3 days of having received the silent treatment from my parents, and really never having experienced that before, I had come to the end of the road. You know, I'd been carrying this weight, I'd been carrying this future, I'd been carrying this upcoming car crash for so long in my mind. And I just thought, I can't do this anymore. Yeah. It's not fair. You know, it's not fair that I was born gay and I'm told that this is somehow something I should be ashamed of and apologize for. And yet now, when I try and come up with a solution, which is to leave, I am still accused of behaving in a way that is reprehensible. You know, it's not.
And I can hear the anger in your voice. It's like
absolutely.
Outrage.
Yeah.
Absolute outrage. Like, I'm done.
Yeah. Yeah.
And anger can be the force that you need to overcome the burden, isn't it? It's like, it is an energy that.
Yeah. And so I went into my mum's room to try and talk to her, not to even tell her about my sexuality, but just to try and talk to her and say, this is ridiculous. You know, you can't give me the silent treatment just because, and it doesn't change anything. And as soon as I tried to speak, and honestly, it just came from nowhere. All of the emotion, all of the heartache, all of the ways in which I had held myself together for, by that point, let's say 19, 20 years, they unraveled. And I burst into tears. But I burst into tears in such a way that you as a parent, you know that there's something really wrong. And I ran out of the room and I went into my bedroom, and I didn't have a lock, so I leant against the door because I knew she would follow me. And then she followed me. She prized open the door, and I was weeping. And eventually I just told her. And so it wasn't I intended to tell her. It was that this circumstance, actually this really happy circumstance of being offered this amazing job, forced my hand.
The sort of breakdown was an unexpected breakthrough in the end, that you unraveled. That it was the tipping point, of you just, it wasn't a decision, it wasn't a plan. It's just the overwhelming emotion. I can't do this anymore. And it was the fissure of rage, right? Like, I'm done.
Absolutely.
I can't stand this.
Yeah, but it was also entirely because of class. Like, if you think about it, the reason I ended up having to come out to her was because we were poor and I was about to not be poor. And that felt to them, if I was going to leave them behind, like an abandonment. And so that's why when I talk about
that was class and culture, no? I mean, it's both.
Yeah, well, culture was the circumstance, but I think class was, well, the class was, the circumstance was class as well, but the catalyst proved to be getting into link laces. And then the idea that I was leaving, that I was taking on this other life for myself.
Yeah. So, I mean, that is, and I know there's much more to your story, and I encourage people to read your book to get your full story, but we only have this time now. So if, there's an 8-year-old girl or boy who's listening in the 69 countries where it's still illegal to be gay, or has the class issues, financial issues that you're talking about, the 8-year-old, the 16-year-old, the 21-year-old, what have you learned that could support them to, I guess, to be true to themselves? Whatever the thing that you're ashamed of or hiding, it's really about protecting people you love, and the protection in the end destroys yourself and the relationship, and it's only love over time, and these things are not an overnight process. No. That can enable you to survive, isn't it? And your parents now accept you, love you, accepted Absolutely. The book, and your siblings. I mean, they are extraordinary. I have enormous respect for them, because that is a big old mountain they've climbed.
Oh, absolutely. I say that, you know, memoirs, to write a memoir feels so self-absorbed, particularly when you're in your 30s. But I say that to the extent that there are any heroes in this book, it's not me, it's them.
Yeah, they've really come a long way.
Mm.
So what would you say to someone who's struggling now?
So bear with me, there are kind of two related points, I think. I really like going to the gym, but I'm not actually that good at it. And I kind of sometimes lift weights, and I have this trainer called Alex, and sometimes he'll put a really heavy weight in front of me and he'll say, Mohsin, lift this. And I'll say, no, I can't. And he says, you can't yet. And he emphasizes the yet. And I think I feel that way about issues of identity, but also personal struggle. You know, it could be that you're going through divorce. Like sometimes things are really heavy to lift.
Because they just are. They're too heavy.
Absolutely. And that's okay. Like, that doesn't mean they always will be.
That thing is driving you nuts, that ear thing.
Oh, yeah.
But so it's acknowledging it's maybe too heavy now. And the yet is now isn't forever, to have hope.
Absolutely. That it takes time. It's not something that, you know, if somebody puts a really heavy weight in front of me, there's no reason I should be able to lift it straight away. But that doesn't mean that I won't always be able to. And then relatedly, I saw this anecdote on TV, and it was about this this little boy and his mum, and they're in a park, and this little boy sees this big boulder, and he says to his mum, oh, mum, I want to lift that. And she says, go and lift with all your strength and you'll be able to do so. And he gets over and he tries to lift it and he can't. And he says to his mum, Mama, you told me that if I used all my strength, I'd be able to do this. She gets up, she goes over, she grabs the other end, and they lift it together. And she says to him, now you are using all of your strength. And the reason I tell that story is because, particularly for young queer people, you don't always have that parent who can fulfill that function. But that doesn't mean that you have to lift those heavy things alone. There are wonderful people in the world who you will find who will help you to lift, who will help you to make that journey a little bit easier, because you shouldn't have to lift alone.
That's a wonderful story. You shouldn't have to lift alone. And for you, I guess it was your friends that loved you at Oxford, Maureen, your brother. You had a particular girlfriend, I think, who was...
yeah, so it was Dahlia, yeah.
Dahlia.
It's Layla in the book, but...
okay.
Yeah, I actually, funnily enough, some people, they read the book and they say, oh, you didn't thank Layla. And I was like, oh, because her name's Dahlia, but I don't think she minds me saying it anymore.
And so that is the lasting thing, isn't it? That in the end, it is the love of others that enables us to survive even the worst, most darkest things that we face. Loving ourselves, letting others love us can help us love ourselves, or our multiple senses of self.
I don't think it can. Sorry,
on.
I don't think it can. I don't think it can help. I think that without it, it's not possible.
Okay, that's better. Yeah, without the love for yourself in yourself that is also connected from the love of others is the thing that enables us to survive.
Yes, I think they're inextricably linked, because I don't think, unless you're a sociopath, I don't think it's possible to love yourself without experiencing people's reactions to you and being able to say, oh, actually, I am able to bring joy or bring something interesting or to care for somebody or to be kind to somebody. And that person responds to me in this way, because I think that by understanding other people's experiences of you, you're able to recognize the things that make you unique and strong and special.
Because it's an iterative process, and you grow inside as other people move towards you, and you can see yourself in them, and that expands you internally, and then you have more externally. So the whole kind of sense of yourself and confidence in yourself grows. Do you have, I mean, that's a beautiful way to end. And maybe we'll end there, but just in case, do you have a question for me?
Yes.
Okay.
How does So I'm trying to think about how best to put this. My ears are they're terribly shaped for headphones.
Mine too. I always fall so.
Yeah,
They're too small in mine. Something.
Yeah. I had a very particular set of circumstances that I am really grateful to the world and to the people, the loved ones we've just spoken about, for being able to say I've overcome.
And overcoming, because I don't suppose it's ever completely over, right?
No, I guess not. But I think that the question I have is how do we manage when everything's okay? So at the moment, you know, touch wood, my
You're happily married.
I'm happily married. My parents love my husband. You know, my family are for the most part okay and healthy, and it fills me with fear because I wait for the next thing to go wrong. So I guess my question to you is, how do we manage when things are actually okay, but also not just manage, how do we thrive when things are okay?
That is such an interesting, good question. I guess, I don't know if I have a good answer, but where your question takes me is that your history of loss and suffering and fear is part of you. It's always in you, and will influence how you see your present and your future. And so the work, I guess, for you is letting the story that you're living now of safety and happiness and love, to trust it, because you kind of know it's in you, but it doesn't sound like you fully integrated it as this is part of me now. This is the new me. And so the work, if you had a therapist, would be, how do I dare let myself know that this isn't going to be taken from me, that I dare trust and believe that I can be fully myself, I can be fully loved and known, and have a life that I've dreamed of, and let myself feel safe within that new life.
Thank you. I think that makes complete sense.
Thank you so much, Mohsin. That's a wonderful conversation. You are a wonderful man.
Oh, no, thank you. Shall I stop recording?
Yeah.
Okay.